Okay, welcome everybody. Lots of great questions here already, so let's get started. On in the group, so our discussion, most people would know by now, but in case you're new, if you go to our MeWe group, that's mewe.com, mewe.com, and it's law of implication, one word, but you can also go to lawofimplication.com and it'll redirect you there. So let's see here. In our group, there was a question here from Mattias, who's working. What does implication mean to you? Why did you call your philosophy law of implication? I'll just kind of address that quickly because there's nothing to the answer. The question's a good one, but the answer is not too profound. In terms of what to call it, I wanted something, a little bit catchy, a little bit something that hadn't, or a lot that had to be something that wasn't already being used. So it's a little bit like a brand name, so to speak, but I'm not selling anything, but just sort of, you still need to kind of have to call yourself something. And I want people to be interested. And it's a little bit of a play on the law of attraction. With the law of implication, the law of attraction kind of hyper focuses on that thoughts are things, and what you focus your thoughts on will kind of attract that into your life, right? Positively or negatively. That may or may not be an oversimplification. But with the law of implication, I'm concerned with. I realize that the starting point question for the kind of outer foundational frame that we need to have is to figure out what's true, how to distinguish between true ideas and ideas that are not true, and so forth. Which that still can be interpreted in various ways, but still. Something along those lines. What's true about what's good and important, right? Is a important kind of way to fill out that, not just how to know what's true, not like national, inquiring minds want to know, so to speak, but what's true about what's good and important. Like what ideas are impactful, and then what's correct. How do I filter right or wrong, correct or incorrect about ideas that are impactful in terms of making our lives better for ourselves and other people. That's going to lead to questions about success. It's going to lead to questions about the mind, about goals, about the nature of our purpose, why we were created, things like that. The law of implication, furthermore, the results that we get in our life are going to actually be the result of a ton of vectors, like a ton of, we can call them causes or reasons or factors in the environment, and what we do personally. And then what we do is also very complicated, right? Between what our mind does subconsciously, what our mind does we might be consciously aware of, but don't necessarily intervene in consciously. Who are we really, right? So like, and who's the we that's doing the doing? What is the doing that we are doing? But there's a lot of factors that go into why anything happens, including our happiness and our success and the things that we want for the people we care about, and so forth. Why we make money, why we continue to make money, why we save money and still have it versus don't, and things like that. And so this isn't in the title, but one way of characterizing the central idea of law of implication is what we can call the understanding line, where if you just draw a line with an arrow going to the right, then as we go to the right, as understanding increases, then that's the best way, both in terms of feeling motivated and in terms and happy and so forth, and not like kind of all the kind of negative emotions. Excuse me, I had an H there. We want to kind of both intellectually and emotionally feel and think progress towards any goal as happening as understanding increases. Now, next webinar, I'm excited, in probably 2 weeks at this time, we're going to continue with the definitive series, and I'll be transitioning from mind and goals and so forth to, not that we've dealt with that comprehensively, but I'll be transitioning to thinking accurately. And the transition will be really cool because I'll be talking about how our minds think by analogy and association and how that works and how we want to understand and work with that, and how we also need to realize the mistakes that can lead to when we don't do something in parallel with it. And so it'll really be eye-opening. It'll give you really a tremendous thinking advantage in all over the place in your life, where that will either just give you an advantage over what you yourself would have done otherwise, and or give you an advantage if to the extent that you need to compete with somebody else, it'll give you an advantage in your relationships. It should really be a great some eye-opening and very useful things that'll draw, like, kind of, we built some framework to get there, and then also it'll give us something to really that we can stand on and use to go to the next stage, the next topic after that. And I bring that up because when I talk about understanding, then there's a substitute that our mind does, and our mind understands difficult questions, which is most everything. A question doesn't have to be deep to be difficult. It can just be like, well, how's this person going to act in the future, right? We're implicitly asking that question constantly, right? Like, of ourselves. We basically need to kind of construct predictions of the future, or our mind does, nonstop, in order to just function, right? Just to make decisions and, you know, big and small, and to do all sorts of stuff. And so our mind substitutes simpler questions, and as it does that, it's in essence substituting an analogous object for the kind of complicated object. So how a person's going to act, like mental object, like how a person's going to act in the future, or what kind of person is this person, or how difficult or how should I feel about a task. In a sense, that's a mental object. Even like an emotion that you're going to feel, or a future event, or a plan. These are all, we can be thought of as as mental objects. And to understand these things, our mind substitutes a kind of simpler, analogous mental object that it comes up with. And then you feel like you understand something. You can see this if someone categorizes something in a certain way, or says, oh, I've met this person's type before. Like, I know this person, right? I know their type. You see? So the actual person would be one sort of mental object. And that's complicated, who that person really is, how they're going to act in the future. And so instead, our mind substitutes a mental object that they've already made, of like an archetype of a certain type of person that it's kind of, that your mind's constructed. So you see how it substitutes that, right? And when we realize that's going on, again, it can be very eye-opening, give us a great advantage. But that type of substitution and thinking by association and analogy, you don't get off of doing it, but it isn't understanding. It can be a starting point for understanding, but it's critically important that it's not an ending point for understanding. And so it's very important when I talk about the understanding line and seeking understanding as progress and gaining understanding as progress, that we don't accidentally substitute the kind of fake type of understanding, the oversimplified analogous type, like thinking by analogy, understanding by analogy. You don't understand something by analogy, except perhaps if someone who understands something very well is explaining using an analogy. But then that should include explaining how the analogy or the analogous mental image, whatever, differs, from, they need to be comparing and contrasting it with the thing you're talking about, right? Because the analogy can't be the same thing, right? It wouldn't be an analogy. So that's my little spiel on law of implication. But mostly it sounded catchy, and the word implication kind of is mixed up with all these things about logic and what things imply. But the word's kind of a little blurry in its meaning in usage. Okay, I think Joseph gets the first one. See if he can get me in trouble here with what's a day in the life of David Mills like. Well, to preface it, I worked for many years, maybe 7 years. I worked kind of 24/7-ish, depending, on the particular day or month. But it was pretty nonstop as I was getting my business off the ground. Starting about 9 or 10 years ago. And there were times before that where I would work a lot, but also before that where I didn't have to work too much. But then I kind of turned a corner in my life where I don't need to do a lot of work. I'm still kind of involved with work a bit, but I'm functionally mostly retired. So what I do is my sleep schedule is very random. So I can keep to a sleep schedule kind of naturally if there's a good reason to. Kind of, it's all kind of a subconscious thing in a sense. But now that there's not, I sleep very randomly. So things like appointments and so forth really kind of are difficult for me. Even scheduling a webinar, I have to kind of finagle things in a way that I'm not, can't do it perfectly with trying to, make sure I'm awake and energetic at this time. But I play a fair amount of strategy games on the computer. So right now I'm loving Warhammer 40K Gladius, which is like a 4X game. 4X means like a game like Civilization, where it's it stands for exploration, exploitation, extermination, which is like combat, exploration, and expansion. Anyway, so I do that. I spend some time talking to and/or playing with my son, who's 9, and he likes games as well, but not quite exactly the same, sort of the same games, but not quite, and certainly not quite when it comes to Minecraft. He very much likes that. And I spend some time with my wife, and I walk to Starbucks. I can walk to my Starbucks, get a little bit of outside, stuff, and I may or may not have a notebook. I could claim that I always have a notebook. There's been times in my life when I've been particularly putting stuff together. When I'm, working on webinars, and I certainly bring a notebook and I work on that. When I work on webinars, then there's some decent amount of kind of attempting to focus and think. Once a little bit of reading, but not too much. Sometimes there's reading other stuff. But some of it's just kind of letting my mind go a little bit on a topic. It'll wander over to politics a fair amount when I do that, which is not necessarily my preference, but it just kind of does. There's a way that I'm kind of interested in the topic. There's something about the way politics kind of magnifies and it's very like real in a certain sense, right? Like there's a democracy, so people are like participating in various things with government just by voting or even supporting in things in a certain way that kind of, in a sense, encourages other people to vote in a certain way to whatever degree that actually encourages people. And then with our culture these days, it's very split and a lot of stuff that results in very real policies that really affect us. With COVID, of course, the politics of COVID really haven't been very interesting to me one way or the other, believe it or not, because I don't see it as that critically important, weirdly enough, one way or the other. I certainly am in the kind of the DeSantis type of camp, Christine Noem, that kind of thing, when it comes to opinion on how to do public policy with it. But anyway, so my mind kind of goes there. All right, there's some other slight politics questions. I can talk more there. Dave Mazzaro says, are you able to hear something negative and not let it affect you? If so, how? It's a great question. You can mitigate the effects of negative things. In some cases, in some cases, some absolute frames that you have will happen to kind of give them almost no power over you. For example, and it's not even because you're so enlightened, it just might be that you by luck have a frame. Like for example, if there's people that you don't consider peers, right? It's mostly people that your mind considers peers in various ways, and peer can mean different things. So like if I go to church, those people are my peers in a certain way. Like if they have opinions on what I do for a living, which they don't, but if they did, it wouldn't really, well, that was like, not like what I do for a living, like it's immoral, but like when I taught speed reading, it wouldn't really matter to me that much what the opinion of someone at church, not that they, again, have them, but just to give I'm just trying to explain something about peers. Like peers are relative to certain aspects of your life, like, so like if you're playing a sport, then you can have peers relative to that sport, or with the, online, or like if there's like kind of strategy games that people play online, which I don't play online these days, but then you kind of have peers for that, but you might not feel strongly about how they feel about other things, about you or life, right, or whatever. So it kind of appears in various ways. You might not care how they think of how you dress, like with certain group of people, but that you do care somewhat, or it affects you how they think about something else. Or you can have customers, right, or clients, and if they feel like the service you're providing is not very good, then that will likely affect you, right? Whereas if you're talking to somebody who's not your client and they were to somehow guess that you're not doing a very good job, or you're talking to your parents, and they're like, well, I don't know, are you really doing a good job with SEO? But they don't know anything about it. You don't feel like your parents are kind of relevant for that, and so it won't really affect you. So in that way, frames, especially including who your mind categorizes up here for that topic, may or may not affect you very strongly, right? Or like if your wife says you're not a very good husband, that probably be a lot more relevant to you than someone else's judgment about whether you're a good husband, right? Depending on who the other person is, but you get what I'm saying probably. Now, so being aware of that can just be kind of helpful. And you can a little bit think and reframe to some degree who and how you consider somebody up here. If you think through why their opinion matters, or why their feedback or their statement or their negative thing matters, that will dissolve it to some degree, or to a greater or lesser degree, maybe to a complete degree, maybe not. In the same way that if you think through something you're afraid of and then go past what you're afraid of, like I talked about in my video about fear, it's not on this channel, but on the different channel. What's the name of that channel, Mike, that we have for OMG with the fear video? If you could type that in. And even if you're, just to illustrate what I mean by thinking something through, even if you're going on vacation, you're thinking what to bring, and you walk through like what you're going to do the first day and the second day, like a little bit, and then you'll kind of realize all the things you might need to bring, especially if you ask what about if the weather changes and so forth. So if you think through why their opinion matters and why they're up here, or why they would know, that sort of thing, then that can help. In some cases in life, you don't want, so I was going to say, in some cases, you just want to get out of a certain environment where you're going to predictably hear it a lot. It's your ability to kind of consciously filter something out. So you can do a better or worse job of that by like what I talked to you about, like thinking through why it matters. So that can give you like a leverage when you are thinking something through and trying to mitigate it consciously, than the impact and negative, if you like whatever inputs can have. But that's a limited resource, and we have to understand that, right? It's not like some people are like strong and can filter things out and overcome things consciously, and other people can't. You just have a limited capacity to do that. And when your kind of mind is taken up with certain types of thinking tasks, or whatever, thinking related tasks in various ways, or emotionally, or if you're literally tired, or even drinking a little bit, all kinds of things, then that resource is going to be lower at that time. And plus, if you just simply use the resource recently, like in terms of minutes or hours, then it'll be depleted. And then there'll be times when you won't be able to filter it out, and you'll react strongly. So, or it'll kind of affect you, in a way, or just the kind of the drumbeat of it, will kind of get you and get in there. And it'll be a vector, right? It'll be one of the implications that's going to affect how your mind kind of concludes and feels about things. So you have to, once again, with stuff like that, the more you're kind of observe it, get a sense of understanding of the pros and cons of the costs and benefits of getting out of the environment, like moving out of your parents' house, right? There's going to be a certain level of disrespect that your parents, in many cases, will have for you based on the fact that they had to wipe your butt when you were 1 and 2 and 3 after you went to the, pooped and so forth. That, you're going to be kind of, I've talked about this in the past, where the mental object that you are in your parents' mind is sort of an averaged out continuum from when you were 0 to your age now, right? Weighted a little bit more heavily for now, but not, but it's still whatever you did when you were younger still is there and kind of in the whole archetype and averaging out of stuff. And then if you've done a bunch of stuff like at college or on your own when they haven't seen, then that really isn't averaging at all, right? So you're kind of, with any person, you're sort of the average of their experiences with you, weighted towards the present, but not, like weighted kind of heavily in certain senses. But when it comes to your parents thinking that you're competent, that's going to be kind of hard, especially I don't know, it's just gonna, and it may be that your mom kind of feels like it's her responsibility to kind of fix you, right, in a certain way. That's just a normal thing for moms, and it might be a thing for dads, maybe also in certain topics, right? I find that if I watch Chance play Civilization 6, the computer game, then all of a sudden I start, acting like his mom and wanting him to get everything perfect and kind of feeling like scolding him if he doesn't do things right. And so which I find kind of humorous, or it's kind of eye-opening, and I like things that kind of help me experience, these sort of flaws or oddities, or things you might see in somebody else in other cases. Then you kind of feel how it happens, how you did the same thing, and it kind of gives you insight. Okay, so that's my answer to that. I'm of course not claiming that any of these answers are fully comprehensive, but they're, I think they're decent length. Could you explain what you mean when you say something is holographic? Yeah, great question. In a hologram is a little bit of a, I forget how to explain how they make it, but if you shine light through it at a certain angle or whatever, it'll create an image like in the air, like of an apple or whatever. I think they put holograms these days a little bit on your credit card because they're hard to duplicate. But they don't function quite the same way where you can necessarily shine light through it and get something. But maybe they do, but there are cards in the back of it, so whatever. The thing about a hologram is if you were to chop that hologram in half or just cut out a piece of it and shine light through there, you'd still see the whole apple, but it would be more blurry. And the blurriness is not the relevant part of when I say something's holographic. What I mean by saying something's holographic is when a part of it kind of contains the whole, or I kind of use it to mean like you'll see the same sort of idea be repeated and play out in different places in life. Like with seeking understanding as progress, or how someone goes about thinking about politics shows an underlying process or non-process, right? Like, so say somebody functions in a, like they're not like someone that's going to really steal from you or violate you in normal life. They're just, common, normal seeming person, right? If they were a neighbor, they would a little bit look after you within reason. They wouldn't like break into your house, right? They wouldn't like punch your dog or kick your puppy or whatever. And then they'll be perfectly fine with very violating things the government does, right? Like I was audited for 2 years, it ended maybe within the past year or so. It just went on and on and on over like 5 years of my personal and business stuff. If I didn't comply, or if they decided on whatever, or if I had cheated in ways which I hadn't, but at some point if I had, or I don't know if I, whatever. If in their judgment they decided they wanted to put me in jail, right? That's kind of goes along with taxes in some way, right? So anyone that wants that system basically wants me in jail, at least if I don't comply. So they're perfectly happy to put me in jail. So I think it's reasonable to say they want me in jail. They may say, oh no, I don't want you in jail. I want you to pay your taxes, not cheat, and so forth. I look at it as they basically want me in jail, because if I do nothing, if I earn money and do nothing, I go to jail. So that means anyone that wants that system that we have now with the taxes, the way they work with IRS and so forth, given that if I make money and do nothing else, they literally want me in jail. So I call that wanting me in jail. If you think through what jail means, it means my wife all of a sudden has no husband. Functionally speaking, it means my son. And let's say you're like a 6 or 7-year-old boy or 9-year-old boy, and your father, who you are crazy about, is just ripped away from you, right? I mean, that's a really terrible thing. And then you can just lose so much. You can lose your career, right? Your house, right? It's easy to think, oh, I'll go to jail for this number of years, but it's actually, if you think through how destructive it is. It's extremely destructive to wish that on an innocent person or just a random stranger who I am to most everyone, right? They don't know me and they want me in jail, right? Again, if I simply earn money and do nothing, the vast majority of Americans want me in jail. And like all Democrats, right, want me in jail. So if you really think it through, that's an extraordinarily sick thing to just wish for a stranger. So that's in the person's psyche. So my neighbor who seems nice and basically kind of acts is nice, but that same exact person in a different situation wants all those horrible things to happen to me, my wife, and my son. And to think how traumatic it would be now, but I mean, at any age, I don't know that it's less traumatic now, but I mean, certainly if he was 4 years old, 5 years old, it would have been devastating beyond belief. I mean, he just would have woken up every day, I think, just in pieces if I was in jail. So that's just a reality. So that's got to show up other places, right? That to me, that define, and then if you think about how we think about like let's say someone committed rape 10 times, but otherwise they act nice and normal, then it's defining for us that they're a rapist. Like we don't say they're a rapist and a normal person, like we don't have a longer phrase, they're just like a rapist, right? Or child molester if they do that, killer, right, if they're a serial killer. So if somebody wants me in jail every day of their lives, and then they also act like a nice person and this and that, then that's to me the defining feature, right? So it's another thing where again, it's like that's throughout their lives, right? If it's gonna show up in large and small ways. Kind of a little bit seemingly off topic from the holographic, but anyway. So I'll point out like in context, but it basically means that like each part contains the whole, and I might stretch the meaning of it slightly when I kind of use it, but it's still, there's a certain feel to it that I kind of feel that I use. So that's my best answer there. Excited for this one, this webinar, high means. So I'll throw some hard questions, so it's okay. Politics question: if we work towards starving the government of its power, how do we deal with national security? Another government can simply enslave us. Yeah, and if we eliminate all governments, will there be other ways of bullying? There will be other ways of bullying and organized crime. What can we do? And I agree. I muse about this a bit. However, the interesting beauty about this question, it's kind of funny with a holographic one. I kind of went over to some political state, like kind of over to like politics, we could say. With this, I'm almost going to go the opposite direction, and it's a political question, but I can kind of answer it partly in a there's kind of a non-political, very practical lesson here, because this really illustrates how to solve problems and succeed. Let me remind you that none of us needs a real method to succeed at the vast, or maybe the vast majority, at least plenty of things that we aim to do each day or overall in our lives. The path is kind of laid out for us, the plan exists, and we can just do it, right? It might take some motivation, whatever, but anyway, like for a lot of stuff that we're trying to accomplish, we don't need much method. We're just going to kind of do it anyway, right? Like we have enough of basically a framework, there's enough luck, framework, and such existing that just happens to overlap with what we need to accomplish that task, that we just basically put in some time and effort and resources and it gets accomplished, right? So the real success question of like, how do we succeed? How do we achieve goals? What's the right way to solve problems is for when that doesn't happen. And that distinction is very important, because if we start thinking about how to solve problems and we accidentally mix in how do we accomplish things where enough things are in our favor that we can just basically focus and put some effort and resources and accomplish it, then we'll kind of come up with the wrong answer. We really, right, like it, again, we already kind of know the answer to that. And in a certain funny way of putting it, you could say your first attempt at solving a problem can be to put some focus, effort, and time, focus, and I guess that's sort of similar, like basically some time and resources, right? and maybe, you know, some basic motivation of trying to get, you know, get it started or thinking about why you want to do it, right? And try that first, and some significant amount of the time that'll just be enough. And then the other question is then, well, what do you do otherwise, right? Like when they have to call in Sherlock Holmes, you know, how should you go about it, right? So then we get to like the real problem solving approach, right? And again, it is the real problem solving approach, what I said. You just put some, you know, time, effort, whatever, and resource into something, and if you succeed, you succeed. But then looked at more broadly, you are, for one thing, of course, looking to build understanding. And as part of that, you want to gather and respect things that you know, and again, like respect those things. Like you start with those things and you do them regardless. And what happens, the reason people don't use what they know is they kind of like they start to focus on what they don't know and remain blind to kind of what they could either do or could know. And then it's too hard for their minds. Their mind kind of substitutes, you know, like an easier question, easier mental object, and then it makes them feel good, like they've solved it and they're okay with it. And that's kind of what happens when people think about government. So this is a very good and valid question. I like it a lot, just in case I want to make that clear as I continue to talk. So no matter what, we start with not doing things that are clearly wrong. So like, you know, extortion, right, is clearly wrong. So it just needs to not happen. I agree that part of why we want to kind of understand the world and its purpose and what's going on with it, and have a better understanding of existence that doesn't only make this life on Earth everything, because it's kind of fundamentally flawed here on Earth. And so there must be a reason for that, right? I don't mean that it's designed wrong, but it kind of sucks, right? Because you're going to have these basically tribal warlords, right? These crime bosses, these gangs, other governments, right? And so forth. Now, interestingly enough, just realistically in our world, in America, there's not really a lot to actually defend America against. Like it's going to be pretty hard for anyone but Canada or Mexico to invade us, and it just seems like that's probably not realistically going to happen. So if we are talking about realistic questions, which I agree is a very realistic question, but in America as a whole, it probably won't get invaded by Canada or Mexico no matter what. Now, certainly crime lords, cartels could like move in to certain places and so forth. Remember, a lot of what prevents people from defending themselves is that the police will literally attack us if we defend ourselves, right? Like the police, the idea is that they're you know, they protect us, but if we try to protect ourselves, then they'll literally attack us. Like say some guy threatens my life or my wife's life or whatever, or threatens, and I go and take him out proactively, because how are you supposed to prevent someone from just killing you? Like when I say like credibly threats, right? Like in a genuine, and then I have to fear the police, right? Also, we've developed a habit of sort of weakness and helplessness regarding defending ourselves. Not all of us, but I'll include myself in this for sure, relative to what I might be without police, right? A lot of things get organized and can happen outside of government doing them, but then when the government does them for long enough, we feel like the government's necessary. There used to be a lot more health insurance co-ops and things like that, and the government got involved with health insurance, and a lot less, right? Same with charity, there's a lot less of it. since the government, gets involved. Used to, adoption used to be a lot simpler, and then the government gets overly involved, and now it's like a nightmare and massively expensive. Government rests on a couple of critical foundation. There's a critical foundation and a critical assumption, right? There's a critical foundation, which is violence, the threat of violence, that it's okay if they're government, that they can violate people in all sorts of ways. It's magically okay. It's like okay for the police to do, not okay for a citizen to do, right? So the idea is that violence is violence, and violating people's property is okay, and to a tool for good, or it might be called a necessary evil. But when you think accurately, then you can think through what a necessary evil must be, and there's no difference between a necessary evil and a good. Like it's just a nonsense term to say a necessary evil, right? Something that's necessarily evil is good. I don't mean good in some like angelic or metaphysical sense, but if on balance something should be done because it's a better outcome, right? That a necessary evil has to be something that literally that choice is the best outcome. They're like, well, there's all bad outcomes. Well, again, if you're making a decision and there's a correct decision that will lead to the best outcome out of whatever outcomes, then that's a good decision, is my point, right? You might prefer some other magical outcome that isn't going to happen, but again, a necessary evil is a good in terms of decision, right? It's the right decision. So it's in that way, it's a good idea to do that thing, you see, necessarily by logic. So when we say, if someone says, well, no one likes taxes, but they're a necessary evil. Well, no, they're literally saying taxes, in other words, extortion is good. And when you're calling something extremely evil good, then you are effectively a monster, right? Like in, right, we can easy, right? Like child molestation is good, right? Murdering your neighbor is good. Burning kids alive is good. Like the minute I seriously say something like that, and people are dead serious when they say government is necessary evil, taxation is a necessary evil, then that's the exact same content as me saying, multiple rape, violent rape, any rape, right, is good. Child molestation is good. And I'm like, no, I'm serious. Child molestation is good. It's the best thing for the kid. It might not be a preferable outcome. I'm parodying this. I'm not saying this if someone has but if someone were to say that because somehow it leads to the best outcome, right? But no, child molestation does not lead to the best outcome, right? Or I use the example of like, what about an adolescent boy? And he thinks that rape is the only way to have sex. And he says, well, how am I going to have sex without it? I don't have to answer that. You just need to stop with the rape, right? And then, or let's say more realistically, let's say he uses, I mean, this is rape, but he uses, those little things that, what are they called? Roofies maybe, or something where you spike someone's drink and they get woozy or whatever. I think Cosby was accused of this, right? By a whole bunch of people, so whatever. But he's like, well, that's that's what works for me. That's the only way. You need to tell me how I can get sex without it, right? Well, now Mahaya, by the way, is not demanding about that. He's asking a great subsequent question. So again, none of what I'm saying is critical toward the question. It's a great question. But it's the toughie, right? And so now, again, things do happen and get organized outside of government. Oh, I was saying, so government is based on a foundation of violating people, violating the property rights, right? That's literally what it's based on. It's harnessing the supposed power for good and thinking of all the wonderful things we can do by starting with violating people's property. And then we can pay for the healthcare, we can do welfare, we can do this, that, or the other thing, all these wonderful things, including, defending against an invader, or at least imagining that we're doing so. Like it's a little bit telling. This again doesn't answer the question, but the founding fathers of America envisioned some sort of potential levy or tax if there was an army, if there was a invasion. but they didn't conceive of a standing army. To them, a standing army was basically an evil thing, like that only a crazy aggressor would do. And now America has a standing army and we think it's normal, right? But they didn't really conceive of having a standing army. To them, an arm to fight, you do it by militia. To them, it was one and the same. Is you rouse a militia in response to an attack, and that's it. The government ran without. There's other taxes which are still bad, but the government ran without income tax for the majority of the history. All kinds of things become normal when you live with them. So that's some various things. Now, I don't necessarily think we should work towards starving the government of power. When I talk, I'm spreading correct ideas and the ability to think about those ideas and filter and get the ideas right. So most importantly is your ability to get ideas right in the first place. Then next, of lesser priority, but still, of course, useful, very well, most practical, but less foundational, is having actually correct ideas, right? Once you have the method, then you want to use it and have actual correct ideas. And I want to spread the method and the good ideas. And the idea really isn't to starve the government of its power. That's not wrong or anything, but the real idea is to keep spreading the idea. It's analogous to, like I was saying, about how to solve problems and how to succeed with tough things, which is the only time like method and success philosophy or success methods really matter, is when it's tough in the first place, right? So you are kind of increasing understanding in this sense when it comes to, there's individually where I mostly focus, but when I talk about politics, really what I'm talking about, and what the reason it kind of fascinates me, or one of the reasons, is that it's the second thing. So I want to spread understanding of my own mind first and foremost. And I've spent a long time doing that in years and hours, in hours and in years. And so the more I did that, the more then the sort of feeling of balance shifted, maybe we could say, to where I care more and more about spreading those ideas to other people. And politics is really where that manifests in a certain way, right? It's kind of like the ideas that people have that affect other people. So there's ideas that can be spread to you that will make your life better. And I care about that, and I spend plenty of time on it, right? When I talk about money, relationships, and all kinds of other stuff, then that's how you can have ideas that make your life better. But then there's ideas that form culture. So culture, religion, and politics are basically the same glob, right? One big blob, right? There's no, like, being like a leftist or Democrat or socialist or communist or progressive or liberal. That's all kind of one religion, right? Where you're it's kind of a some sort of weird mixture of nature worship and government worship, right? But it's worship and it's practiced as a religion, and and a culture, right? And culture is similar, where you feel like other people that don't. It's a culture is a bunch of moral standards, right? That are kind of arbitrary, and so people naturally, let's say you are in a culture where tattoos mean you're like lesser status or even somehow morally wrong. Then you see someone with a bunch of tattoos and you just feel like they're like a lesser person and you're less inclined to hire them, right? And so that's how culture works all over the place, right? Like Protestants, to their shame, did it to the Jews, like as they were coming as immigrants, then their kids became lawyers and doctors and professionals, and they weren't allowed in various country clubs and law firms. They made their own, and became successful, and then it's kind of cycles around, right? And then my theory is that a lot of the reason why a certain generation of Jewish people were so democratic, some part of it is just a feeling of, well, Protestants, white WASPs and so forth, right? They're, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, they're Republicans and they're, looking down at us or, excluding us. And so we'll join the other party, right? It's kind of the anti-WASP party, right? For a while. And who knows? right? There's a lot of reasons for a lot of individuals. I'm not trying to point everyone with a brush or whatever. Just I kind of wonder about these cultural things. And again, culture, religion, and politics, they're all kind of one and the same, right? Um, and including any like so-called religion will have a whole bunch of culture and politics in a particular country, things that will kind of be presented in a religion and in church as like certain things you do, they're tied into the politics and culture of that country. Like they're kind of inextricable. And again, like someone's politics really are their religion and vice versa, and everywhere and so forth. And these ideas have a real impact on people, on individuals, on people's quality of life, on, like look at North Korea, right? Whatever, right? Like there's the realities on the ground are very impactful. And we're seeing that in America in all sorts of ways now. And with COVID, it became very tangible. For me, it was always so tangible. And so COVID is, and whatever the policies are relating it, it's just like so relatively unimportant to me compared to the effect of taxation and a number of other types of things. The way that health insurance is just butchered in our country, not health insurance, but everything to do with health care, getting health care, the way it's all screwed up with employer stuff, and it's all because of government, intervention. Oh my gosh, and the way that doctors, right, the government literally violently, because everything the government does is based in the threat of violence. By the threat of violence, it prevents people from practicing medicine. You need to go to a government-approved school through a government-approved process, which is incredibly torturous, not torturous, but torturous, like winding and long and everything. It's just radically long, right? For a while when I was like in high school and college, I wanted to be a psychiatrist. But to be a psychiatrist, you have to go to college, do extraordinarily well, like 3.6 or something to get into medical school, which is incredibly high grade point average in a college, especially kind of the better ones where you need to be in to mostly get into med school. Not totally, but mostly. And then you go to med school for like 4 years, and then there's like residency, internship, and specialization in psychiatry, as far as I understand it. And it's just you're like 30, with like no love life, right? By the time you can do it. And so the government violently interferes with the supply of medical devices, the supply of medicine, the supply of doctors and other medical professionals. And of course that's tied in with doctors associations, right? You get all these professional associations which then lobby the government and to make the people richer and support the their members or existing members. It's like the same as property in California, right? It's astronomically expensive because once people own property, then they want policies that exclude other people from owning property, right? And building more smaller residences and whatever, right? And so property prices go through the roof. And here medical prices, I mean, it's just not even prices, but even being able to get the care in the first place, being able to get the medication, right? We're 2 years into COVID and they've suppressed discussion about treatment and care. And if you're sick, what the heck do you, or if you have a loved one who's sick, what the heck do you do? Do you fearfully stay away from them? Do you just expect them to fend for themselves? Like it's, right, because you're like a leper, right, so to speak, in our culture. And then Omicron is kind of changing that because now everyone's getting it. But for a while, the idea, starting with basically with Biden's election, was vaccine, and we're not going to talk about anything else. And before that too, right? I don't mean before that, not Trump. He was trying to take a very whole approach to the problem. But anytime he talked about therapeutics, he would be absolutely eviscerated. Right? Or Joe Rogan talks about therapeutics, eviscerated. Like it's this, I don't get it. It's so sick, this mindset of, and so do you even know? Like if you get COVID, what on earth are you supposed to do? How do you treat it? And there's some treatments now, but you feel like they're scarce, like you don't know where to go to get them, right? It's like bizarre, right? And that's been going on more invisibly before COVID. But so the medical situation overall, I've been aware of. And it's horrendous in the United States in terms of what it could be, right? And it's just doesn't matter about the United States compared to other countries. It's just it's sick that violence is used to prevent people from getting medication, prevent people from making medication, medical devices, and then just simply having more doctors. And by the time a doctor goes to the freaking torture ringer of becoming a doctor, then they expect to make a ton of money. Like um, it's just a crazy whole cultural edifice that's come about. And culture, it evolves through no one's intention exactly. It's not, most of these things aren't conspiracies. They're just, these things that happen when you concentrate power, because so the foundation of government is this violence, and like, we can do all these great things with violence and violating people's property. And the assumption, if you look for it, is that people that in government are particularly angelic, right? Like, you can't defend yourself. You can't use your judgment on defending yourself, but police can. Police can do all sorts of things. What's the assumption there? Well, they're more angelic than your normal person. Otherwise, it makes no sense, right? Like, it has to be that's the assumption. Or the FDA. Well, they're more angelic. They're more wise. They're more good. They're more able to resist temptations to do wrong and be greedy than your average person, than you, basically, right? Not even average person, but the whatever, right? So we're gonna violently force their dictates on you. And again, the only reason could be they're more angelic. The only reason for an FDA is the assumption of angelic, superhuman wisdom and morality. And the only justification for cops, the same thing, that they have superhuman wisdom and morality. You can't defend yourself. They have to defend you. Because they have, again, the only possible reason, they have superhuman wisdom and morality. I mean, you can disguise it. They have training. Who are they trained by? People with superhuman wisdom and morality, right? Like, you just take it up a step. Oh, yeah, it's like the smoke screen. Oh, well, as long as you take it up a step, I get it. Okay, those people are angelic, right? They're trainers. The people teaching doctors and approving of doctors, right? The people who run the medical schools, those people have superhuman wisdom and morality. And so they're in charge of who becomes a doctor in our country. You practiced medicine overseas, you come to America, you can't practice medicine. You basically have to go through a tremendous amount of hoops and relearning stuff for tests and crazy stuff. It's absolutely evil and very practical. And so all of those are examples of, so I become fascinated by the spreading of ideas in other people in a cultural sense. And again, culture, religion, politics, same thing, because there's a genre of ideas that affect each other, right? And what people approve of and scold people for and cancel people for in day-to-day life, like, it's all tied together. It's all very impactful in aggregate. You can try to ignore it, but try ignoring the IRS, right, or the government. Like, you can't do that. If you're paying, under Obama, it was up to like 43% of your income, of your money you would make in taxes. How do you ignore that, right? I mean, ignoring things on a certain level always makes a certain type of sense, right? Like, if a woman's getting abused and raped nonstop, then telling her to like not feel bad about it and ignore it has a certain validity and a certain way of looking at it. You just say, well, just come up with a story where it's fine and good, right? Or if a kid's getting molested or abused, if they just kind of look at it positively, then there's a certain benefit to that. But I'm all for not thinking about politics and taxes and so forth when the bottleneck in your life is something else. But just like with any kind of defense, right? People that do have the interest and bandwidth for that bottleneck, it's useful to be working on that because it's a massive bottleneck, right? There might not be any bang for your buck in a particular person working on it. But for me, when I'm thinking about ideas, and again, spreading them in my own mind and working on them, but then also in an individual to make their personal decisions, but then this kind of aggregate type of idea, type of thing, I also find it very important and interesting and impactful But again, it doesn't mean that as an individual for yourself that that's a good bang for your buck. And I say that reasonably frequently, but I'll say it now as well. So I'm not trying to convince you. I keep it like to focus on it. I'm never trying to imply that you yourself should focus on it in your life right now. For plenty of people, it's not the place to focus, right? It's better to kind of have it off your mind. But you can't ignore it, right? Like you just have it happen to you and just do your best to not really think about it because you can't really impact it at the moment. But again, it's useful for other people to be working on it. And I feel interested and motivated to work on it, and it's related to the idea of ideas. Now, someone could say, but David, more people would be, you might turn some people off initially if they hear you talk about politics, or if you call Democrats evil, and so forth. I agree with that. But then when do I talk about it? Like if I ever say it, then it can be the first thing people hear, right? In the definitive series, I kept it to a fair minimum. I would say, especially for myself, for how much I feel kind of like talking. So it's a whatever. Like I'm aware of the pluses and minuses, but it needs to be talked about. And so at some point, if I talk about it, that could be what someone hears first, or whatever. So whatever. I try to balance things out. But yeah, and I didn't really answer like how, will there be other ways? What can we do? And so again, like the colonists in America who rose up, even like the Taliban, right? They ended up winning in a certain sense, and they didn't do it by taxing people in the beginning. People kind of joined them ideologically, and a lot of them would have been thinking in their mind. I don't agree with the Taliban at all, but they organized a kind of grassroots, in a sense, resistance, right? People joined them. I'm not saying that they weren't running schemes here and there to get some money, but and I'm basically in no way speaking positively or defending the Taliban. I'm just pointing out how you can either look at the founding of America and the colonists. They didn't run around extorting, and they beat the British without extortion, right? So people can defend themselves. Can there be problems? Like can you be defeated? Yeah. I mean, can someone come along? It's it's a scary idea to all of a sudden have no government. But I'm not saying what people should do. I want people to understand that taxation's evil. And so people can start by coming up with schemes to use taxation for the so-called good. Right? Like we can stop expanding it, draw things down. But none of us have any power to actually do anything. I mean, sure, we can like vote Republican, right? I mean, but Republicans still mostly like taxes. They're still stupid and evil I mean, they're good in ways, right? But you vote Republican just in order to have things be a lot better, right? Like you want Florida, you don't want Michigan, right? Or California or New York, right? When COVID hits, right? You want Trump trying to solve problems, like someone that's actually just basically trying to solve problems. He only looks partisan because he's attacked in a very partisan way. He doesn't have partisan instincts at all. He just looks and wants to solve problems. He doesn't think like, well, what's my ideology? If you actually just stop and look at the guy and how he approaches things, right? He might go by his gut to some degree, although even then, when COVID hit, he listened to experts. He had certain ideas, like he wanted to get out of Afghanistan. That's what his gut told him and what he wanted to do. But he looked at it with generals and people, and he was convinced that drawing down in a certain way, and he had a whole kind of thing he was doing that made a fair amount of sense in a kind of a complicated situation. So his general process towards solving problems is just basically someone that's doing trying to solve a problem and doing it reasonably effectively. And then with Biden, it's just obvious that there's this radically different way of approaching things, right? That has something to do with who he owes favors to, who's on his team. I don't know that he himself has an ideology because he says all kinds, throughout his 40-year career, it's put on all kinds of different sides of things, but it's kind of like whatever his team is pulling for at the moment, maybe, there's kind of like, this is what it means to be a Democrat now, whatever, right? Like, but it isn't like, let's solve this problem for the, to try to, so everyone kind of wins as best as possible. So I remember before the election, there was a question I was talking about truth, and someone said, like, well, my girlfriend asked, if you care about truth, then why do you like Trump? Well, hopefully now you can see, right? Trump's approach to dealing with things. Again, just take something that isn't inherently political. It's not like before COVID happened, it wasn't a political issue, right? It became a very political issue for some bizarre reason, right? Like therapeutics are terrible was the Democrat position. Like before COVID, they didn't have a position like that. It didn't exist, right? It was just like, apparently Trump likes therapeutics because Trump's trying to, like, it's just weird. But yeah, if you like truth, then it's true that the approach that Trump takes towards dealing with things is just going to lead to better outcomes than the approach that Biden takes to dealing with things, right? I mean, it's just if you get a sense of what methods work for problem solving, and again, there's like a kind of a hierarchy, right? Like, isn't it Trump has like the perfect success method by any stretch? But I mean, but he's fairly close, like reasonably close, right? He's pretty close to like one thing, almost like one thing away from what I would improve on. So I would improve on it significantly, but still, but Biden, of course, is just not even anywhere near, right? It's almost like he has a method for purposely making things worse. Or I mean, he does have he has foundations and frames that will predictably make things worse. So yeah. Okay, how can we frame the death of someone dear? I see cultures where there's a positive attitude towards death. Yeah, so right, with death, with one asterisk, like, now of course we need to cater to other people's consciences, right? So I don't, if someone's grieving for someone, I don't, just try to, basically only if someone asks me would I, talk about how to mitigate death if someone's grieving. But if someone asks, well, I can't see any reason to be the least bit upset about somebody dying, right? Like you can't do anything about it. Like there's a basic method in life, like kind of thing, like being upset about something you can't do anything about. It's understandable. Like any of us can have something kick off for a moment where we're upset. So there's two different things. There's being there's upsetment just kind of happening, and where we just feel upset about something, and then there's like feeling like it's our duty to be upset about something, like we should be upset. It's just false that we should be upset about anything. That's just blanket false, always, all the time. You don't need to feel upset about whatever. If an idea is wrong or hurtful, then you can, like just look for the correctness in what I said there about you don't need to feel upset. Doesn't mean that you're, a lesser person because you feel upset, but it's not like you should. It's a glitch. It's an anomaly. Sorry, it might not be an anomaly in a lot of people's lives, but it's something to look at and figure out where your wrong ideas in your mind if you're getting upset about something. But you don't think like, oh, I should be upset about that. And especially like you can't even like there might be times, I couldn't tell you for sure, to express anger because it's a potential communication tool. So at least there's very possibly something to accomplish with. And now expressing grief as a communication tool might maybe fall in that same category, but there isn't really a reason to feel upset yourself. Now, then there's a related potential question about wanting justice in some cases if you feel like someone's at fault. Justice and fairness are both ideas that you should have red flagged in your mind. Neither is a good idea. Deterrence may be a good idea. Making it feel non-economical for somebody to hurt you might be a good idea. But justice, like doubling bad, basically, that is never a good idea. Stopping someone from doing something again, from whatever, it can be valid, right? Like if someone did something bad to me or someone else, very bad, and I somehow could metaphysically know that they were not going to do it again, then I wouldn't want anything to happen to that person because there's no point. The only point in stopping someone, killing them, in stopping them some other way, like jailing them and so forth, would be to prevent a future bad thing. So to the extent that that's going on, there might be some validity to that. But there's nothing about something bad that demands that more bad needs to happen. It's just an instinct. There's a social instinct to punish people that violate cultural rules, and then there's a feeling of satisfaction for that. And it's a false idea. It's just like things that are gross, right? That things are gross kind of for reasons like, right, like they're basically the body thinks that they're kind of unsanitary, right, in various ways. I mean, I'm probably oversimplifying, but that's basically what it comes down to. Probably, if I'm wrong, that's fine. But what I'm not wrong about is that the mind conflates gross with immoral, and that's wrong, right? It's false that something gross is actually immoral, and so that's not a kind of like red flag. Just to give another example, sort of thing, whether it's like a certain type of instinct or in our mind or way of kind of going. And then fairness is it's never like inherently, it's not like the foundation for things. Like a fairness could be the correct conclusion in a certain scenario. Like dividing something that, that people kind of, for all equally deserve or whatever. But whatever. So fairness might be the right answer as a conclusion, but it's never a premise that you want to build off of and say, here's why I'm doing this for fairness, right? You're doing something to make the best decision, right? The decision that is most good, including that it doesn't violate anyone's property, right? There's no greater good in the sense, like greater good is never correct if it involves, to the extent that it involves violating someone's property. Like there's no such thing as you violate this person's property, but there's a more benefit somewhere else, right? Violating someone's property, bad. Unless it's dealing with them, like fixing a property rights violation, then it's a gray area and so forth. But just violating, like an innocent or stranger or kind of a person where you're not like correcting like a property rights violation they did, then it's always wrong, and there's no such thing as any kind of greater good consideration period. It's not relevant ever. Same thing with fairness. You don't use it as a premise. You don't say, like this is unfair, therefore, and it's used, right? It's used that way where such and such is unfair, therefore we need to violate people's property in order to make it. All right. Sorry, that's a little bit far afield from death. Basically, you just want to be able to personally let go of thinking that you should feel bad about anything. There's no reason to feel extra bad. I've pointed out in the past that however bad you feel about something, then that's how bad you already feel about it, and you don't need to add bad. You don't need to add to that. And your mind doesn't need to add to that. So, but if your mind does make you feel bad about something, then okay, it makes you feel bad about that. At some point when you have the focus, you can work and try to figure out why your mind decided you should feel bad about something. Like you want to understand things. You want to understand how to make things good or better, right? You want to understand how to break bottlenecks, right? These are all different variations on the same thing. So you want to gain understanding. You don't need to feel bad about whatever. you want to feel motivated to break the most important bottleneck, right? But feeling bad ends up being this kind of thing that feeds on itself, where you feel bad about one thing, so you need to feel worse about something else in order to, deal with that, right? Like if you feel like you don't want to get up and do your work, then you might want to think, I need to feel how bad I would feel if I lost my job, or didn't have money or starved to death, or whatever. But you don't need to. You can break the whole cycle of feeling bad. How can we frame it? Well, we don't know what happens after people die. God, as we understand, God created existence so that we could choose to love and choose to have a relationship with God and each other, where we loved God and loved each other, meaning we want each other and God to have the best value of experience, right? In order for that to happen, we need to understand more about what's good and important, right? So that's it, right? And so we can never, another way to put it is, you can never know enough to know that you should definitely feel bad about something. So since you don't know enough, it's a gray area, and therefore you choose not to feel bad. That's another way to put it, right? It says gray area. You don't know what's going to happen to them after they die, or how your life is going to play out because they died. And so you don't know that it's going to be bad, and so stop feeling bad about it and assuming it's going to feel bad. It's a gray area, so feel good or ignore it, or just focus on something constructive. So that's my answer to that for now. Sometimes our brain is constantly switching between goals. Any suggestions? Great question. Once again, one of the things you can do is think through, just like I use the example of you going on a trip, and you think through each day and then you figure out what to bring. And the lesson there is not that you should think through your trip to know what to bring. The lesson there is that when you think through your day of a vacation, you will realize things to bring that wouldn't have occurred to you otherwise, and most likely. And your brain, it feels like obvious, like, oh, that's simple. And you'd think that your brain already did that, but your brain doesn't work additively. It doesn't, it works in a different way. And it does not think things through without you leading it by the hand, so to speak. It might seem to approximate that by having had a previous experience that it substitutes through analogy. It substitutes the mental object that is the previous experience for something else, and it can feel like you think something through because it just substitutes something that approximates it. But it just simply doesn't think things through, no matter how obvious something is when you do think it through. Like those lines I showed you, where I showed you last webinar, where I don't have the slide right this minute, but where your mind can easily average out a bunch of lines of varying lengths and draw a line that's the average, approximate average of, if there's like 6 lines of different lengths that are drawn for you, that you're looking at all at once, then you can draw a 7th line that's very approximately the average of those things. That's a very easy task for your mind. But your mind doesn't add up all the lines to see how long they would be end to end. It just doesn't do that automatically. It's very simple to do so if you're on purpose adding, right? Addition is easy for your mind to do, in essence, if you lead it to do it, but it does not do it automatically. And don't confuse the two. What I mean is, don't confuse how easy and obvious the sum is when you sum something up with that your mind already knew it. It totally didn't know the sum, even if it's easy to sum something up and then know the sum. And that's holographic, to give an example of the earlier question. That'll show up all over the place, that, like, the idea that it's obvious after you sum it up what the sum is, but your mind absolutely did not know the sum previously. Realizing that in life and seeing all the ways that that manifests itself is huge. Therefore, when you think through, if you achieve certain goals, which should be one and the same as breaking certain bottlenecks, what the impact will be, then it might be at that point obvious which one is more important. And not only will it be obvious to you in that moment, but to your mind will likely get it and see it and take that into account emotionally. But it did not get it and see it previous to you thinking through, like walking through how life would be after each of those two goals were achieved. In other words, the bottlenecks were broken of the two goals. And one what might obviously be more impactful than the other to happen first might help the other one, right, or whatever. If they just seem the same after you do that, which is probably fairly unlikely, but if it happens, then you could say, well, I just saw that they're about this, they seem about the same when I think it through. So it's now a gray area. So is it better to absolutely go after one? Probably, and prioritize one. Since the more you internalize that in a gray area, you get to choose what to believe, and it's so valid. So you could say, well, I'm going to choose this goal because it's a gray area. They both look the same when I think them through. And absolutely this goal, now it's no longer a gray area. You chose one of them. You're going to say, I decide this goal is radically more important than the other one. I'm choosing it. In your mind, when you internalize this meta idea properly, your mind has no objections. It can't have any objections because your mind gave it its best crack and it was gray. So it has no power over you anymore. You can now decide. Once you show your mind that it's gray, when it like its best efforts lead to I don't know, then you could just pick something and tell the story how you want, and its objections are gone. Because there's this implicit idea that your mind knows something that's like very wise, and it really knows something that you don't, and you should like listen to what it has to say. But if it already showed you that it couldn't tell the difference between which goal was more important, and then you say, well, my plan A is then this one, I'm going to pick this one. Then what's it going to do? Half an hour later, is it going to say, no, I'm going to switch. I'm going to feel like I'm going to switch to this other goal. Like, what the heck are you doing? It has no ammunition. It can't make any case that you should switch to other goal because you said you already showed me what you had. You already showed me your cards and you had a crappy hand. You couldn't tell the difference. You already told me. So I choose this one. So get off the other one. Believe it or not, that should work. And again, the more you internalize that gray area thing, it's actually just awesome. What's our next question? What's our reality construct, or what is the correct reality construct? Okay. Let me start by something else. So if you are watching a movie, let's pick one, Star Wars. Okay, you're watching Star Wars, whichever one, the trilogy, all of them, the nineology, whatever they're. Your reality construct, not for your metaphorical reality construct. The analogy I'm making here is, let's say you watch all 9 of the movies, you read some books, you watch them again. Your mind will create a construct for the Star Wars world. It'll have mental objects with certain data points and so forth, right? Characteristics and feelings and associations for the various characters, for the various concepts, like Jedi, various worlds, Tatooine, right, and so forth. I have a very moderate knowledge of the world. I'm not like a super fan of Star Wars or whatever, but so your mind will create a construct for the Star Wars world, universe, reality. Okay, and I could use the Marvel movies, right? The Marvel universe, similar. So you have a metaphorical reality construct, a Marvel universe construct. You wouldn't call it a reality construct, neither would I, because it's not what you think of as real reality, but it's the Marvel universe pseudo reality, right? It's real within that universe. You could state facts about that universe that are really true and false, right? Unless the different writers contradict themselves in different movies, but let's say they didn't, right? Then there's kind of like a canon, right? It's called, which means like the real facts, the real mythology and so forth about that universe. For all the world building that's happened in the Marvel universe, let's say. And you could discuss it intelligibly, right? Because with you and someone else, they have a construct of that universe, that world that's been built, characters, concepts, places, events. You could argue about whether, what decisions characters should have made or what should happen or what would happen after a movie, like in that world, after the events. because we have a more real seeming reality that we live in, and we on purpose go and watch that as a movie, we can easily differentiate that, okay, that's the Marvel universe, that's not reality. But again, your mind creates a construct of it. Okay, so for what you think of as real reality, like your real body, your real brain, the real earth, the hardness of the table, your real room, your real house, you also have a construct that your mind has created since you were born. Because you don't step out of it to some other reality, in essence, like you might step like kind of within it to like a sub-reality, right? Like the Marvel universe, but you don't step back from it in a way. Like you don't have an experience like Neo stepping out of the Matrix, right? So Neo in the Matrix movies had a reality construct that was the Matrix. And what was interesting for people about the movie is this idea of waking up to stepping fully outside of that. But what he stepped out to was fundamentally similar to our normal reality. It might have had different features, like machines had taken over instead of Democrats, right? To make a little joke there. But evil machines, evil Democrats. But in my way of seeing the world, he stepped out into a reality that was then real, right? Out of the Matrix. And it was interesting because it's different than starting with your normal reality and watching a movie that builds a whole universe or world like the Marvel movies. In this case, it was starting out and like thinking the Marvel, like you have a body in the Marvel universe, et cetera, and then you step out of it, you're like, oh, this is real reality. So your reality construct you feel like is reality, whereas the Marvel universe you don't. Neo thought what was in the Matrix was reality, and that was his reality construct. Then he stepped out of it to a different, and then his mind would have had to create a construct of this new world that he stepped into, but that was now he was learning was real. It turns out that what you think of as reality has a whole bunch of real implications. Like if you hurt somebody else or violate them, that's real. But it isn't real in the sense that we think, and it's also not accurate or complete. It's a construct, but there's an idea in NLP, and this all a little bit relates to what I'll talk about next webinar in two weeks. With NLP, there's neuro-linguistic programming. There's the idea that the map is not the territory, that your mind creates a construct of reality that it thinks of as reality, but it's really like a little bit like a map of reality. The idea of a map is still an analogy to your reality construct that's not perfect. So it's not actually exactly like a map. That's why I use the term reality construct rather than the map is not the territory. But these concepts kind of overlap. They're a little bit similar. Saying the map is not the territory and me talking about a reality construct. Your mind has, again, a construct of the world. It views as that construct as reality. It's really not actual reality. It has plenty of overlap with reality, somewhat like a map overlaps with the town that it's a map of, but it's also very different than the town. It's different in some very fundamental ways. It's not that it's wrong, it's just of a very different nature than the town itself. And there'll be times when using the map will function identically to, like it doesn't, there's a lot of times that it doesn't matter to distinguish between the map and the territory. But then there'll be times that it matters a lot. And so that begins to talk about what I mean. And what's the correct reality construct? That's like saying what's the correct analogy to have to something else? What's the correct map? So a correct map is different than an incorrect map, but there's no such thing as a map that is the territory. So what do you want from a map? You want it to, again, be correct as far as a map can take you, right? So you want it to be a correct map, but then you furthermore need to understand that it's a map, not the town itself, not the territory. So those are both important. And I'll deal with that more in the future. Great question. Isn't land ownership being born into a social contract? And Dave also says, I'm all for land ownership so that we can have our own private homes. Okay. So I think what Dave is asking is, I pointed out that there's no such thing as a social contract in the sense that you're born already agreeing to a contract and you're contractually bound to like pay taxes and show up for jury duty and so on and so forth, right? There's no such thing as a contract that you're born into or that you're automatically signed just because you didn't move away or whatever, right? So social contract is a BS excuse for violating someone else's property, right? It's what government worshipers, kind of use as their BS. The simplest thinking about contract shows that it's BS. You never have an actual contract that you'd say, oh, you signed this because you were born, or you signed this because you didn't move, right? That's absolutely not how contracts work for good reason. You need to be of sound mind, not forced. What's the other word? Basically, yeah, you need to not be under any kind of undue pressure or anything like that, right? You can't not just because you don't move. So the only real contract is one that you voluntarily sign without having undue pressure on you and so forth. By undue pressure, I don't mean that that you're undue pressure by like the people having you sign the contract, or people acting as agents for that person. That's who can't pressure you. You might be pressured by circumstance, right? You might sign a contract to perform a service for a client because you are pressured by the fact that your finances are low and you don't have any money in your bank account. That's not what I mean, but of course, by undue pressure. Okay, so isn't land ownership simply like isn't our property ownership basically because of government in essence, or something like that? While acknowledging there's some validity to it, you don't own your body because the government says so, right? The government doesn't give you any rights. It doesn't give you any property. There's complicated questions to ask once we clear away the fog and the BS of government, right? But we're realistically not in a situation where everyone's starting from scratch and there's just a bunch of land and no one's claimed it, right? And so forth, right? People live in houses, they've paid for them, they paid the people that bought it, eventually from people that built it, and so forth. And it gets ridiculous when you start trying to go back many generations and worry about that, right? So I'm not saying there's plenty of gray areas around the edges of property ownership. What's not gray is we understand that I can't walk over to my neighbor with a gun and say, give me $100,000, or I'm going to shoot you in the kneecap, or I'm going to put your wife in my basement and lock her there for 10 years or whatever, right? That's not a gray area. And so we know that we don't do that, right? Taxation's not a gray area. There are gray areas when it comes to property and who's exactly what's your property and so forth. But like any problem solving approach, success approach, or dealing with anything, we start with what we know, right? So like at some point with sexual harassment, there's going to be a gray area, right? Again, I guess that could be taken out of context in some way, that statement I said, but if you kind of look for the correctness in what I'm saying, right, there can be behavior that's a little bit boorish and that a woman might or a man might wish that the other person wasn't doing, but it is kind of unavoidable, or it's just kind of like bad social skills, and it's not exactly like a violation of property, right? So there's gray areas with that, but then there's certain things that are not gray areas with what you do with harassment or worse, right, with another person, same or opposite gender, and and so we can start with that, right? If you have that first night idea, like that was in Braveheart, right, where the English lords could just take one of the peasant wives of, I don't know, Scottish, Irish, whoever, and have sex with her on her wedding night or whatever that was, then well, let's stop that, and whatever the gray area is with sexual harassment, we can discuss in the gray area and deal with it on a case by case basis, whatever, right? But the clear evil violations, stop with that and then go from there. And I'm talking about stopping with it like idea-wise, certainly as an individual, and then idea-wise. I'm not really talking about what we should do to change the political situation right now. My way of dealing with that is to just accumulate what we know, which is we want individual people to have correct ideas about property rights and violations and that sort of thing. Things we call politics, but I don't really think of it as exactly politics or religion or culture. It's all kind of a thing, right? Where I want people to have correct ideas about basically other people's property, including correct ideas about not moralizing about things that are not violations of people's property, right? A lot of culture, there's a ton of moralizing and judging about things that, like I said, in some cultures, some Protestant culture and others, I'm sure, tattoos are looked at as like wrong, believe it or not. I hadn't heard of such a thing, but then I came across it, like morally. And so we don't want people to moralize about those things, right? People moralize about homosexuality, as shocking as I feel like that is at this point. But so we want people to stop violating people's property. We want people to stop judging and moralizing about things that are not violations of people's property, et cetera. And again, there's gray areas, like with things with drugs. If somebody gave my son heroin, I would be perfectly, including selling it, I would be, at any age, I would be perfectly, I would find it perfectly reasonable to go kill that person. I'm not recommending doing so or not. I'm not saying what I would actually do or not, but it'd be perfectly reasonable to go kill that person in my mind, for me. I'm not advocating or I'm not making kind of any statement about what the correct idea is. It's a bit of a gray area about what you do to stop things and so forth. Regardless, or it might not be if I thought it through, maybe it wouldn't be a gray area. Maybe we'd definitely do this or that. But in my current level of understanding and thinking, whatever. And so it wouldn't necessarily have to be illegal or not, right? They could just be afraid of parents who might just go kill them if they give something to their son or their daughter or whatever that is going to just destroy them, right? And so, so that would not really be a gray area for me. And then there could be other substances that would be more of a gray area, right? So it's confusing, like it's gray area at some point, and then it's not a gray area others, and we can start where it's not. Love to hear what's been on your mind lately. Oh, did I just skip over? Oh no, I told you the day of my life. I'd love to hear what's been on your mind lately as well. I'm thinking about the thinking by analogy categories. I recently just realized that kind of categories in terms of also paradigm shifts, where they can immediately kind of impact things. I pointed out there's a certain anomaly, a certain thread that I've been pulling and trying to figure out, and I feel like I've had a bit of a breakthrough that it will impact what I talk about next webinar. Where it seems like a simple illustration, but let's say, I've mentioned this before, but let's say somebody cuts you off in a car, and you're like, oh, that person's a jerk, and then you see who they are, and they're like someone that has been very beneficial to you in a way that clearly you immediately are like, oh, that person's not a jerk. Maybe they just made a mistake, or they didn't see me coming, or whatever. Or maybe when they drive, they're a little bit reckless, but they're still a great person. And so you have this kind of and I'm not saying that I'm saying that imagine this happen, like this type of thing could happen, right? So there might be something like this where it doesn't happen that way, where it changes you, where you think, oh, I thought that person was nice, but they're a jerk. But I'm saying there's such a thing as the following thing happening, where they cut you off, you feel like they're a jerk, but then you have kind of a paradigm shift, or the story in the prologue of 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, where these kids are acting up on a subway train, I think it is, and then people are kind of judging and wondering why the parent or the dad doesn't seem to be interfering or getting them to behave. And then at some point he looks up and he says, "Oh, I'm sorry, the kids just lost their mother, and they're probably acting up or whatever." And he says, "I'm paraphrasing." And then there's like this instant paradigm shift from they all feel kind of guilty for judging, right? And all of a sudden they understand. And so those kind of instant shifts where we can have a major change in whether we're tempted to do something, in how we would approach something, how we think about something in a way that could easily impact our behavior, where we would all of a sudden be motivated to do something, or easily drop a bad habit, or easily do something like do cold calling that we might not have done before because of a categorical shift of some sort, theoretically. So I'm very interested in, like, I take those examples as where I feel like there's anomaly there, and I don't chunk up in those cases. Say what people will do with anomalies is they'll kind of do the opposite of pulling on the thread to find out what's there. And they'll chunk up and they'll dismiss it and say, oh, well, that's a paradigm shift, or that's whatever, like something where they stop being curious and they just kind of categorize or label it, or something where it kind of now it's understood, but they didn't get what could have been gotten. Another example of that might be if your kid miraculously, well, for me, other people's kids apparently cooperate a lot. In some cases, in a lot of people's kids, like it's kind of fairly normal to cooperate. That isn't the case with my situation. And so I remember, like, sometimes Newt early on cooperate once in a while, and just kind of, we'd ask him to do something that wouldn't be like the thing that he would be looking to do, and he would be like, okay, and do it. And it would be like astonishing, right? Like, oh my gosh. And so for me, I would get a lot out of those things because I would try to pull on the thread. The instinct could easily be to say, like, oh, he's cooperating for this reason or that for that reason, and kind of just explain it kind of in a way that's chunking up, I call it, instead of trying to dissect it and really think about what went on, and not even think that I got it right away. Like, I'm not in a rush to milk all the data or understanding out of that. I kind of keep coming back to it and think about what the factors might have been, right, and so forth. And it turns out, in this case, for example, that Chance, my son, like when he feels a good reason for something, even if it's not something he would naturally want to do, it's like night and day. Like he's actually probably a lot more reasonable than a lot of other kids. But in the absence of a reason, he's a kind of extremely on the uncooperative end, in the sense of cooperating in terms of like just kind of doing what we tell him to do, what parents call cooperating, which is doing what we want him to do against what he himself wants to do. But then if there's a reason that resonates with him, bam, like it's kind of like often night and day, although it's not quite always exactly that simple, but it sort of is, sort of isn't. But so I would kind of spot that and investigate and kind of get that. Anyway, in general, we want to pull on these threads. And so it's about what's been on my mind lately. And so I kind of recently had a bit of a breakthrough on this kind of thing that relates to our mind substituting these questions and then analogies and mental objects, like I've talked about, analogously, and then feeling like it understands something, and then how categories that our mind does is actually just a kind of relates to that. It's kind of an example of thinking by analogy or switching a mental object. Like a category is like a mental object itself that is almost serves as an analogy or a substitute for understanding. And then that also relates to NLP, and the map is not the territory, and how we can switch that around. So I kind of had extra insight on that, even though I had a number of the pieces already. I kind of had an extra insight, and then that fit together with other pieces. And I think I'm going to have a pretty breakthrough kind of cool thing for you next webinar. That answers. None of these are, again, what I mean, like I answer something like kind of fully and totally forever, but that's my answer to that. Bryn says, if you see a distinction, I'm getting a little short on time here, but if you see a distinction, with what do you keep it consistent? With what do you keep it consistent day by day? I find that distinctions reliably get lost as time passes. Huh. So there's one idea, of course, that I talk about, ideally, that you'll see something that you don't unsee. So his question is, what's the kind of difference when you kind of see something, a distinction that kind of gets integrated and you don't unsee it, and it kind of gets worked into day-by-day decisions, your mind kind of takes it into account, versus you're like, oh, that's a cool distinction, but then functionally speaking, your mind, especially subconsciously, doesn't really take into account, and will kind of go back to its old way of thinking or something. I'll try to think about that and see if I can come up with something better than what's occurring to me now. Lawrence says, what about intellectual property? That's a lot blurrier to me than physical property. When does IP make sense in the way of protection, if at all? certainly there'd be plenty of ways it would make sense, I think, because I think like when we create a course, right, in my businesses that I've had with information businesses, and you have a membership area and people make videos and teach stuff, I think that's what is example of what's intellectual property. And so someone like breaking into the membership area or sharing it in a way that violates the agreement, or the, not even the agreement, but like what we're selling, we're saying like, here, we're selling this for your personal use, not to be shared. That's a real thing. But I don't necessarily, I haven't put a lot of thought into where the line begins and ends. If we at least want to respect people's personal property, we're asking questions about what's property and how does it work, then that's great, right? At the point when people don't want to violate others' property and want to understand what our property is and where the kind of lines should be drawn, then that's great, especially if we're asking that in good faith, which of course Lawrence is. So it's great to be asking questions like that, because it's kind of the types of questions you ask when you respect the idea in the first place. Elia says, hi all, good luck in being more correct today and less off. That's a funny joke, and I take it. I don't want you to be less awesome. I just want your goals in life to less be about thinking that you're awesome and more be about breaking the actual model. That's funny. Hi guys, says Peter. Hi everyone, excited for today. Building my understanding about how the mind uses associations to construct reality has been unbelievably useful for me. Oh, that's a nice, because I've talked about this a lot in the past. Good. And so that's a nice thing there. Mahai says, one time in the past, you explained to us a safe way to invest money once you're financially free, a way in which you're paid monthly until you die, right? The annuities. My question is, doesn't it get affected by inflation? Doesn't devaluation affect your annuities? Could you give a brief overview of why you're financial? Yeah, absolutely. It gets eroded by inflation, so you need to take that into account and have enough money that, now you can structure annuities to make up a bit for inflation, but that's kind of no different than kind of saving more money, having more money. Like you could put in 250,000 to an annuity that'll pay you out when you're 60, and it could either pay you out, let's say $2,500 every month, or it could pay you out 2,000 like every month until you die flat, or it can pay you less, like 2,000 in the beginning up to 3,000 or 4,000 much later on, right? That might be a choice that you might have with an annuity. Or you could just put in 500,000 and get 5,000, flat or more, so it all kind of amounts to the same thing. In other words, or you can take the money out, get the money when you're 60, that's the flat rate, and just put it somewhere where you'll get some interest. But yeah, inflation is going to eat away at our money, and we just have to try to have enough that we can get past that. You're always trying to invest for the best balance between return and risk in a certain sense. If you have money in a house, people would say, oh, don't count your house because you have to live in it, but not necessarily. I mean, you can live in a smaller house later on if it's an emergency and so forth. So you can get a house, that's kind of nice and appreciates. My house, obviously like everyone's house probably in the country, but it's gone up, where it was kind of like a $700,000 house at first, maybe 750 or something. And now it's about over $1,050,000. So that, as inflation eats away at some of the stuff, then real estate tends to go up. So you have a little bit of a buffer there. Yeah, but that's kind of my answer there. It's more of like a math question, understanding that inflation can happen and having a bit of a plan. I'm going to inherit some amount of money from my parents at some point. My family tends to live forever, like historically into their mid 90s. And my parents are like, mom's probably in her mid to late 70s. So that's still like, I'm sorry, there's a little bit more of it, but like 15 or more years off. So, but a little bit helps with inflation in my sense. Of course, not everyone has that. So you kind of just do math in different ways. I'm not dismissing your question. I'm just a little short on time, and that still kind of gives an answer where there's not like some great magic, thing. I did talk about last time that there is a way to do with stocks, where which kind of mirrors a thing that happens all over the place in life, where you're kind of ready to catch luck spikes, a little bit like having your sail out for when there's wind, right? And instead of thinking that the wind is going to be constant, which is a little bit like when people think about compound interest. Of course, compound interest works mathematically speaking when you're doing math, but in real life, it's more about the wind is off a lot of times, or it can take you the wrong direction sometimes. But then if you have your sail in the right way, then you can catch a good wind when there is one, and then be trying to not be taken too much backwards when there's not one, and so forth. But be kind of thinking that way with the stock market, where you expect to kind of come out even or behind for most of it, but then there's kind of like these big up spikes, and then the rest of the stuff kind of washes out. So you can, I'm not currently harnessing that, but you can look to have that be part of things. Lawrence says, oh, how do you keep from coming across as condescending when discussing LOI with other people? Oh, I don't. I'm just coming across as condescending. I mean, you know, like Socrates had this thing, kind of cool. He had actually had one of his people that admired him, liked him. They went to the Oracle in Delphi and asked the Oracle. By the way, archaeologists have found that there was actual ethylene gas and other gases that were in that pocket. So the Oracle was built and it kind of housed those gases, and they actually caused like a hallucinatory state that the Oracle would kind of go into. Anyhow, she said no, there wasn't anyone wiser than Socrates. He asked, is there anyone wiser than Socrates? She said no, one word. And so the guy told Socrates this, and Socrates was kind of bothered by this. And so he went, and this is fairly early in Socrates' life. And so he went to other people that were considered wise, and was surprised to find that not only did they have a bunch of contradictions, and they basically weren't wise because they had contradictions in their own ideas. But then when he would point those out, instead of being happy about being educated, they would get angry. And so they're not only do they have flawed ideas, but they had a flawed method for correcting their ideas. And so, and then it goes on from there. You can read the story if you want. I actually read that in a kid's book for Socrates that we got for our son, but it's kind of those, sometimes kind of kids' books are kind of a fun, easy way to read something. I was recently accused of that, which is particularly annoying because I go out of my way not to trigger anything like that with a few people I do discuss it with. One thing you can do is just ask people questions, and sometimes not even point out their contradictions. I'd sometimes just ask people questions and kind of have them contradict themselves and not even point it out right away, unless and until they're kind of at a point of kind of repentance, or they're kind of notice it themselves and kind of come to you or something. But it's tough. I mean, there's no magic formula that I know of. The magic formula is this for people. It's what I'm trying to do. There's people that are close. It's like the broken windows only for good. The broken windows theory of crime, right, is that people, instead of they're just being criminals or not, right? The broken windows theory of crime, which you might be somewhat familiar with, Malcolm Gladwell has written about it in one of his early books, maybe Tipping Point. Is interesting because it also shows this contextual idea that I talked about last time about people tend to over rely in terms of their story about causes. They tend to over ascribe the cause to like agency or like the person. So it's like criminals commit crime, and so you just need to punish them, right, to prevent crime. But really, you have this continuum of how people are, and then there are these environmental factors that sort of imply, this is another kind of law of implication thing, where it implies to people that are kind of on the edge that it's okay to leave litter around, right? If things are more dirty, if things are more clean, you feel less like leaving litter around, right? And then, so like people that were like doing fare beating, like hopping over the turnstile to not pay their fare for the subway, crimes like that, graffiti they would clean off, these kind of signals, and literally like broken windows, right? Like if there's a broken windows in like a bad area of town, people feel like they can break more windows. I don't personally feel like I want to break any windows, but some people like they feel excited about breaking windows, right? So, or they're in a gang and it's cool, we can do this, right? You feel powerful if you can destroy something. It's a lot easier to destroy than to create in a lot of cases. And so if people feel powerless, then destruction is, for a lot of people, an easy way to feel power. So anyway, when it comes to LOI, there's people that are close, like generally speaking, you guys, right, are examples of that. Since you're on the webinar in the first place, a lot of you have been following me for a while. It wasn't like just that my powers of persuasion were greater with you than other people that have encountered me and had the choice to follow more, right? So hundreds, maybe thousands follow along in various ways with LOI, and then thousands don't. So why some, not others? Some were closer, right? If there are broken windows, why do some people break windows or commit crimes? If there are graffiti and people beating fairs, then and more muggings, and if you get rid of those, then there's actually less murders and stuff, believe it or not. But why do some people then commit crimes? If there are broken windows, why do some people break windows and some people not? If there's litter around, why do some people then litter when they wouldn't, but then other people still don't litter, right? So given my existence and what I'm doing, then you guys who were close, right, I kind of pushed you over the edge, right? I kind of lowered the activation energy, gave signals that it was important and so forth. And so as we do that, going back to the crime metaphor, as there's the graffiti and the fair beating where they jump over the turnstile, commit kind of like low level crimes, you get more of like the mid-level crimes. As you get more of the mid-level crimes, you get more of the high level crimes. So as we expand, right, we'll get more people, or even reach the people like you guys more first, right, but that are close. And then that signals more people, right? And it even, right, that there's people that would just kind of be interested, they kind of get drawn in quickly from the ideas. There's other people that might see more views and likes and comments, and that triggers, that makes them feel like there's more going on, and then they're going to participate more, right? And so instead of trying to convince people in my life much, unless they're particularly close or want to, then I kind of just try to be like the opposite of a broken window, right? But whatever the signal is in the environment, and then those that are close will come, but maybe not that many people are close right now, right? And then as more people, so it'll kind of catch fire more and more, starting kind of slow. I'm also a bit not focused on spreading myself so much as getting the ideas right and communicating them effectively. And then just at the kind of infancy of getting kind of spreading it publicly. Okay, I better call into things here. Great. And a bunch of other things, but great. So I think I actually made a pretty good dent on the question, so that's great. Thank you very much for your participation. Thank you very much for your participation overall with the definitive series, and for your participation even helping with YouTube and the algorithm and so forth. Obviously likes, comments, and such, and views. Great. If you have people that'll just subscribe to something, even if they're not going to listen much, but they subscribe, just if you're just like, hey, could you subscribe to this? Because we're trying to get to 1,000 views, whatever. You can also ask them at this stage of things, by the way, if you would. All right, excellent, guys. Thanks. Great. I'm glad you like that, Eric. Awesome. The opposite of a broken window idea. I love this place. Thanks, Lawrence. I appreciate that. Love you and everyone and you guys' participation. Wonderful. Yeah, it went really well. I'll give a little bit of a time so people can build up some questions, but I'll definitely do this again. It went really nicely. And I was thinking of saying at the beginning, if this goes well, I can kind of take the credit. If it doesn't go as well, I can blame you guys. But I didn't make the joke. I forgot about it, but also I forgot because you'd already have put a bunch of questions before the webinar, so that worked out great. All right, so this went pretty well, so I'll take the credit. Although actually I can't because there was a bunch of good questions before I got started. So actually that plan backfired. I'll have to credit you guys as well. Very counterintuitive answers, a lot of food for thought. Thank you. Wonderful. Well, thank you. They're kind of, hopefully they were correct as well. Not that we can in some cases know for sure yet, but you're very welcome. Okay, guys, have a wonderful couple weeks, and I'm excited about the next webinar. Definitive number 8 it'll be. Have a good one.